Welcome to the Food Professor Podcast, Season 4, Episode 3. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm the Food Professor, Sylvain Charlebois.
Our very special guest on this episode is Marie-Yves Fournier. Marie-Yves worked for Les Affaires, Rue Frontenac, Le Journal de Montréal, Radio Canada before joining La Presse in 2013. She's an award-winning journalist. She's won the Judith Jasmine Prize and a Kenneth Wilson Prize. And I'm sure, Sylvain, not your first time speaking with Marie-Yves, huh?
No, absolutely. She's delightful. Very happy that she's accepted our invitation. She doesn't give interviews all that much, so I'm very pleased that she is able to join us today. And she's one of the best in the business, and so I'm looking forward to hear how she deals with her craft, how she gets her ideas. Because every week I read her stuff, and she gets you to think about the future of food a lot.
She's very prolific, great writer, and I'm happy to give her more profile outside of the province of Quebec, because sometimes journalists who write in French don't get that kind of profile. So thrilled to give her that kind of sunshine, so to speak. So we'll get to that
exactly
a little later in the show. Let's start with congratulations to Premier-elect Wab Kinew, Manitoba making history last night, electing their First Nations Premier of a province in Canada. Amazing when you think of it, Sylvain, that his father basically wasn't even allowed to vote freely in an election. We've at least made some progress, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. That was a delightful win, to be honest. And I think it gives us all hope. I think his story is all about hope. And I was very pleased to see the results. And I'm not surprised it's happening in Manitoba, because I lived in the prairies for many years. And when I started as an academic in Saskatchewan, 20% of my classroom were Indigenous students. And so it was kind of normal. Like, it was really, and you kind of learn how they think, and it was about a circle of knowledge and sharing. And the experience is very spiritual as well. And I loved it, just loved it. And when he was giving his speech, his victory speech, you can feel the approach was very, very similar. And it reminded me of my days in Saskatchewan. So I'm not surprised it's happening in Manitoba, and hopefully we'll see more Indigenous leaders become premier and potentially prime minister one day. Who knows?
Absolutely. Now, any thoughts on challenges or opportunities in our sector, the food sector, ag sector, for the incoming premier?
Well, I guess obviously, if you look at the map, the Manitoba map, he was elected by the North. And so obviously the North has always been an issue when it comes to food security. Feeding the North, developing sustainable methods to feed the North has always been a challenge forever. So, and that's part of his mandate. Manitoba is a unique province with the Churchill pathway going to Churchill, because with climate change, the North is going to become a critical path towards other markets. And so logistically, I've always believed that there's so much potential to develop, gateways east, west, but also north. And Manitoba would actually play a very important role. And so if you do it right, I actually would bet that the north there could be developed even further, not just with populations just living there, but actually contributing to the overall national economy through logistics, for example, and trades as well.
Let's continue to talk about politics. So, following up on your grading and posts about, how we reviewed the impact of the carbon tax, the Bank of Canada. Now your friend, Mr. Poilievre, says, what is he saying is he forwarded or liked one of your posts. The Food Professor catches the Trudeau government trying to hide the true cost of carbon tax on food. 332,000 views, 1,100 retweets, including yours. So, first of all, do you think the average Canadian believes that when you retweet a message that you agree with the author? What do you make of that?
Well, it says in my profile that a retweet doesn't mean an endorsement. I just retweet things that are interesting, but I actually didn't even agree with the tweet at all because we were talking about the Bank of Canada. We spoke about it last week during the episode. The Bank of Canada's method to evaluate the impact of the carbon tax on inflation is obviously an underestimation, I think.
Needs work.
And so the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, believed that we caught the Trudeau government. We didn't catch the Trudeau government. It was just the Bank of Canada, which is a Crown corporation. And then, well, yeah.
Should we pause to explain that it's an independent Crown corporation?
So we've got to be careful here. So we need to be careful here. I don't think that Prime Minister Trudeau is behind some of the calculations of the Bank of Canada, for sure. But as you know, the carbon tax or the carbon market and carbon pricing, any policies related to carbon pricing is highly contentious right now politically. And so right now the opposition is using every single thing, including some of my tweets, to argue against carbon pricing because they actually believe that it impacts inflation. And I think it does, but to actually pinpoint how the carbon tax is impacting retail prices is very difficult and probably almost impossible. Industrial-wise, that's a different story. I think with industrial prices, there's more to it. It's much easier to unpack cost structures and see exactly how fiscal policies can impact costs, because the impact is much more I would say direct. But in retail, as you know, I mean, you're an expert in retail. What's the number one factor affecting prices at retail? Consumers. Consumers' demand will impact prices a lot. So costs are one factor, but it's not the factor.
You know, it's just generally a little bit confusing. Who was it? Our friend Quick Dick McDick retweeted your retweet.
Oh, yes.
About...
Yes.
And he said, "Listen, it's hard to understand." I mean, he did a great video, just saying, "Hey, listen, when I make my product, you're paying a carbon tax in the truck that takes the product to the market. So listen, it's complicated, right?"
Oh yeah, it's a very and when I was in Ottawa a few weeks ago, I did meet some Conservatives MPs, and that's exactly what I said. I mean, I saw the ads on television, and that. It's just be careful when you oversimplify a very complex issue.
Well, populist politics are politics like that anyway. Let's talk about new research from the lab. The first one of the season. I guess this is the first research you published in a little bit. Is it the first one since last season? We're looking at food affordability, how people think about nutrition. Some pretty big numbers. 64% of Canadians have substantially altered their grocery shopping habits again. And I would say that they also did that in COVID. So this is a double tap on changing grocery habits. And no wonder it's a hard time to keep up with what we're all thinking. 86% Canadians now consider themselves more price conscious compared to a year ago. So take us through the survey. I mean, some pretty, in one way, it should be no surprise to anybody that more people are more price conscious. That should be no surprise to anyone. But digging through the research, what did you learn, and were you surprised with any of the findings?
Well, first of all, we just wanted to know how Canadians are coping with food inflation after so many months of higher food prices. Unlike 2008, when inflation went up to 15% and went back down again as quickly as it went up, it really wasn't a huge factor, but this time around it just lingers and lingers, and I actually think, I don't know what your thoughts are, Michael, on this, but I actually think that we're creating a new cohort of frugal consumers, similar to what we saw in the early 80s. I mean, people were all about sales, and Cheese Whiz was cheese. It was just, people were very careful with their money as much as possible, and when indulgence came after, but it took a while. I mean, because interest rates were at 15%, unemployment was very high, over 15%. It was worse than now. But now what you're seeing are groups of consumers that are seeing the cost of money, the cost to borrow money, to be actually more than zero. I'm exaggerating, of course, but if you look at results, millennials, oh my God, millennials are hammered by higher food prices right now because on the one side, they have to pay more for their mortgage. I mean, the oldest millennials right now are what, 43, 44 years old? They have a mortgage probably. They're paying a high rent. So all of these things are making that one generation feel more pressured than other generations right now. I mean, I'm an Xer, and you're a great gen, or no, sorry.
Yeah. The greatest generation. That's right. When I fought the Second
World
War. Yeah, I'm kind of on the shoulder of boomers and Xers.
We've gone through this before. I mean, we've gone through this before. When we started our career, I mean, interest rates at 15% was it, basically. It was all we had. And so you're kind of teaching a new generation with higher interest rates, and that's really hurting them when they go up at the grocery store. And so I think that a lot of them are struggling right now out there.
Well, a couple of comments, and this is based on, I talk to a lot of retailers on a day-to-day basis, and I've started to make some of my own observations. And two things, and this is not a new observation for me. In fact, it's the title of my keynote presentation I've been delivering: the bifurcation of everything. What's different than 20, 30, 40 years ago is there's much more polarization of income. So you do have cohorts of people really struggling, but now you've also got cohorts of people, and some of that's reflected in your survey. When you make $150,000, you're a little less worried about the cost of food, who are not worried about the cost of food, who are indulging, who are doing very well. Now they're spending money slightly differently. And this gets to my second point, and I've started to call it cash flow shopping by consumers. What do I mean by that? Well, when you run a business, Sylvain, there's two ways to run a business. You always keep one eye on cash. I mean, if things are tight and sales are slow, you run it on cash, right? Because if you run out of cash, you run out of your business. Cash flow, managing your business like a cash flow, right? I think consumers are doing exactly that. And there's a big group of consumers who are shopping by week, by very strictly the budget. And what does that translate to? And we heard about it a little earlier in the year, and you were in the media talking about people shopping at places like Dollarama. So Dollarama, you typically, in a consumable, would get a smaller amount of it for, of course, a lower price. Now, if you went to Costco, on the other end of the scale, you would buy a gallon of, Tide or whatever, and the per ounce rate would be cheaper than the per ounce rate you're buying in a smaller bottle anywhere. You've got now two types of people. Costco's doing really well. What does that tell you, Sylvain? A lot of people are buying value in larger sizes, right? So that's how they get their value, right? I'm going to buy a gallon of Tide.
They have space in a car.
And they have space in their budgets. And they're conscious. This gets to your 84% of 86% being conscious of price. My way to save money is buy and invest in like a gallon of the product. A whole bunch of Canadians on the other end of the spectrum, their way is, I can only afford to spend $3 on, grocery detergent this week. That's what I'm going to spend. It may be more expensive per ounce, but that's what I'm going to spend, cash flow shopping. So I think this is what, in my mind, and we're seeing it in society coast to coast.
In the survey, you see that there are two schools of thought to your point, Michael. Some decide to go to the grocery store more often than before and buy less, but some actually will go fewer times, but will buy more per visit. So the Canadians are split on that for sure.
Yeah. I think I have that sense of that's what's happening. So we'll keep a close eye on that. And you see that.
But when you buy in bulk, when you buy more, you need cash, you need a car, and you need, because let me tell you, when I live in Austria, when you live in Austria and you have no car, you weigh things you put in your cart. Like as you go through the grocery store, you don't buy 2 cases of beer. You buy one, because you have to go up the stairs and you have to walk back home. And people with no cars, I suspect that there are a lot of people who will go more often to the grocery store and perhaps find that enjoy tonight deal they want as much as possible, save as much money as possible, and go home with as little as possible and go back every couple of days. So there's a lot more of them out there, because as you're just stating, a lot of them are struggling.
Yeah. Well, it's something to keep an eye on, because we're all trying to explain what's happening in society and with our people.
The weirdest thing is that according to Nick, formerly Nelson IQ, sales in volume have dropped in Canada. So people are not only spending less on food in Canada, they're actually buying less in volume, which likely means that people are wasting less food because
which means prices should come down, though. Then, if buying amounts,
absolutely
right, it means prices should start.
I mean, today I've had like 20 interviews with media and say, "Oh, over the weekend, Thanksgiving, nobody's going to invite anyone because it's too expensive to feed people." No, not exactly. No. People will probably, because it's so well known that food prices are high, I don't think that people will be shy asking guests to bring over like a salad or a dessert or do some potlucking a little bit. I think that's going to be, and I can tell you that bird, people are going to eat it all over 2-3 days. If you buy a bird of a 15-pounder or something, they're going to eat it all. Past years, they say, "Oh, we're going to eat as much as we can, and let's see how it goes." But probably this year they'll make a boil. They'll make soup with it. They'll do all bunch of things just to they'll stretch their money as much as possible, which is great.
We'll put a link in the show notes to that study. Great study, very insightful, and continue to help everyone understand what the heck is going on. Now, speaking of what the heck is going on, let's take a break from the news, and let's hear from our most excellent guest, Marie-Yves Fournier from La Presse.
Well, this week we have a very special guest, someone I've known for many years, someone I've actually worked with on certain files, someone I respect a lot because she goes, her work goes beyond headlines. So she really does a deep dive in many important issues affecting the food industry, and that person is Marie-Yves Fournier from La Presse. Marie-Yves, welcome to our podcast.
Hi, nice to be here today.
So to start things off, Marie-Yves, why don't you tell us a bit about your journey, how you became a reporter and now a columnist, but I'm not sure if you consider yourself a columnist, but tell us more about your career and how you've become the person you are today at La Presse.
Well, 20 years ago, I started writing about retail in a newspaper, and I've always been passionate about food, probably because my dad is an agronomist. Both my grandparents were farmers. I saw my mom cooking all the time, all day long, every day. So I was in the food thing forever. And when I started writing about retail, I had to write, of course, about grocery stores, and they're part of our life so much. So I put those two things I like together, like food and retail, and I decided I would write a lot about food and grocery stores. It's been 20 years now, and I went through many trends and many waves of things that happen in Canada about food. And I love food so much, not just eating, but when I travel, for instance, I always keep myself a few days just to visit grocery stores. What I did in Zimbabwe, I did it in Namibia. I do it every time I go in anywhere in Africa, or is it in Europe or in United States. I always visit some grocery store, and I think that you learn so much about people and how they live and what they like and what's their lives like. Yeah. When you go to grocery store, you understand just everything there. So I read a lot about grocery stores and the trends all over the world. So even if I don't write as much as I would like to on food, I always read a lot about food. And I cook a lot too, even my bread and cereals and everything, because I love food. Good food.
Listen, I mean, you write over 200 articles a year. That's like almost 4 a week. That's all. You're so prolific. How do you get your? So you do travel. You're curious. How do you get your inspiration as a journalist? How you build your craft?
I visit a lot of grocery stores. I take time to look at what's in the grocery store. Are there new products?
Packaging,
new prices? Yes, packaging.
Yep.
Yes, exactly. Packaging, promotion, new products, more or less products, local products, new kind of shelves, new kinds of marketing, new loyalty cards. And I don't visit the same grocery stores every week. And I go in other stores too, like Walmart or Dollarama or Canadian Tire, to see their food too, because there is more and more food everywhere, even at Winners and stores like that. So I read a lot about what's going on in other countries, and I ask a lot of questions. My favorite one being why. Of course.
Yeah,
why is it like that? What happened? And I talk to people. Also, in 20 years, people trust me, and they call me and they send me letters they got from the grocery stores. And I talk to suppliers and farmers, and I talk to distributors. And so I talk to people, and I just ask them what's going on. How are things going right now?
Yeah. I mean, with your work, clearly you give a voice to readers, to people shopping, not just stakeholders, people in the industry, but actual people, consumers, concerned about certain issues. Every week, every time you read your articles, you do pay attention to what people are concerned about. What are some of the most significant trends that you've observed in Canada over the last few years as a journalist? What are some of the key things that you've noticed that really you didn't when you started your career 20 years ago?
The first one I would say is that people don't have time to cook anymore. People talk about food all the time. They watch TV shows with cooking shows. They read or buy a lot of cooking books, but they just don't have time to cook. So you saw all this industry of meal kits, the Uber Eat deliveries, the ready-to-eat food in groceries. So there's a lot of new services or products that were created because people don't have times to cook. That was pretty interesting over the years. One of the big trends I wrote about is the plant-based options. I mean, At the beginning, there were just like no words in French. How would we call Beyond Meat? Is it fake meat? We didn't even have the words to write about. And then at the beginning, it was only like fake ground beef. And then it went in fast food, and then you saw those fake chicken nuggets, and now you can find plant-based cookies and plant-based milk. And this was a big trend. Now we don't realize how difficult it was even for grocers. I wrote about that. Would they put the plant-based stuff just by the real ground beef? Would they put it aside with veggies? Where would they put the fake milk in their grocery? I mean, that was a big problem, and they had to make space for all this new big category. It was not as easy as it looked. And now, of course, one of the big trends right now is inflation. Everybody talks about it. And I wrote a lot of stories in the 2 years, I would say, how people adapt and change their habits for inflation. They change the type of grocery they go to. They buy less food. They switch to private label. They look a lot at flyers. So that was an interesting trend, because I was looking at the text I wrote in the last few years, and about 6 or 7 years ago, I was writing a lot about deflation and how it was hard for grocers to see their sales going down because the price of food was going down, and they had too many employees. So that was exactly the opposite of today. And the last trend and it's more recent. I would say it's in last year, or not more than a year. It's the importance of loyalty programs. Now you have prices for member only. You have co-branded credit cards. All the grocer put a lot of emphasis on their loyalty program, and that's something that was not important 20 years ago. Today, everybody has a cell phone, so in grocery stores, you see a lot of people with their cell phone, so they can scan their card. That's quite new, and it's not everybody who likes it. Those prices for member only are very criticized by consumers.
Fascinating. Thank you for your introduction of what and how you do what you do. I mean, if we think about 20 years ago and the rise of not just the different trends, but all the social media food blogs, people like myself who have a YouTube site on food, amateurs, basically. Anybody suddenly become, an amateur. So as you think about all that, do you ingest, so to speak, all that social media that washes over us every day? And how does it change, if it does, the way you do your journalism as a professional? And how do you think of that with, anybody with a keyboard and a mobile phone can have an opinion and get 1 million views, but they're not professionals. And you must think of that a lot about how you do your trade, yeah?
Well, I would say that social media didn't have a big impact on my writing or on my work. I don't, probably because of my age, or I don't know, but I don't go that much on social media. For me, it's not a real or a serious source of information. So as a journalist who's looking for facts, I really prefer to just talk to people in the industry and see what's going on and ask for letters and proof and emails. Of course, in the last 2 years, I would say inflation has a lot of impact on real people, on consumers. So a lot of people go on social media to talk about the price of food, and they would criticize how grocery stores are doing promotion. Like I was saying, those prices for member only, or prices, lower prices if you buy 3 or 4 items. A lot of people who live alone criticize that. But social media is not an inspiration for me that much, except probably for this $8 cauliflower story a few years ago. The picture of the cauliflower and the price was everywhere. It became viral on Facebook. Of course, I had to write about the price of cauliflower. Again, I was wondering, why is it $8? And I wrote a lot of stories about the prices of fruit and beef, and it's always very interesting. I mean, people just are scandalized by the price of something, but I mean, as a journalist, you have to go further and just explain, okay, what happened? I mean, It's not just someone who decided to make more profit yesterday. there is a reason. Usually it's a climate change, it's a big storm, it's there's a reason. So my work is to explain and tell people what is the reason.
Yeah. You said earlier on that your number one question is why. I'd imagine you ask that question 4 or 5 times on the same issue before you get to the real answer, right? Like the first why often is not the real answer, right? I think that's what you're saying. Would you agree with that? That, the first why seems like, people are trying to make more money, but the reality is much more complicated, yeah?
In food, it's always more complicated than it looks. There are always a lot of issues, and answer, you're right, are hard to find. In a newsroom, the food sector has the reputation to be the hardest one to write about. Yes, because grocers don't talk that much. The relationship.
No, that's right. Absolutely.
I mean, the relationship with their supplier is difficult. Suppliers don't want to ruin their relationship with the few grocers there are in Canada, so nobody wants to talk. So it's very hard to get the truth. And one of the best example I have, you make me think about it, is there was a shortage of tofu a few years ago. And I was going every week. I had to do like 3 or 4 grocery store in my city to find tofu. After 2 or 3 weeks, I was saying to my mom, I don't know what's happening over here. I can't find tofu anymore. And she said, oh, you know what? Where I live either. So I tried to find an answer in the medias, and nobody had written about it. So I called all the grocery stores to see if they could explain what was going on. And all the grocery stores told me there are no shortage. But I was seeing it with my eyes every week for many weeks, and my mom in another city was seeing the exact same thing. So there was a shortage. Finally, I called all the companies in Canada who make tofu, and they told me what were the problems, and there were a few problems. So this very, very simple story took me a few days to write just because nobody wanted to explain.
If we think about the issues today, they really center around food affordability and how that connects with how and what people can buy. You mentioned it earlier, where people are a little frustrated that they get a bigger value by buying more, but they don't need more, like they live alone. Do you agree? Do you think food affordability right now is really an issue that's top of the charts of Canadian society, or what politicians and your readers are thinking about?
It's probably the number one topic people are talking about and concerned about, probably because people do the grocery every week. They see prices all the time. And so it's very hard for people just to understand what's going on, and they try to find who's guilty. It's very hard for people just to understand everything. Is it energy prices? Is it labor shortage? Is it climate change? Is it war? I mean, sometimes it's very big issues that are far from them, and they don't understand why it has so much impact on them in their own life. So
I would say, though, they're all looking for someone to blame.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's unfortunate, but there is not one person to blame. So there are many reasons why the price of food rise. When the cauliflower went up to $8, well, it was not one person's fault either. So it's, as I was saying, issues in food are very different, and there are many issues, and it's very complicated to understand.
And it's also very emotional too, eh? To a certain extent. You know, you like a product, and all of a sudden if you don't understand why a product is suddenly so expensive, you will kind of go after, you'll blame the grocer or something. But there's no rationale to the observation at all.
Yes, people blame the grocers because they know the grocers. I mean, the grocers are part of their life. They are on their own street. They walk on the street and they see the grocers. So who do you blame? You blame the people you see, so it's easier to blame the grocers, but we must understand that they are not guilty. Or they do what they can, right?
That's right. So you've been doing your work for almost 20 years. What advice do you have for aspiring food writers or journalists looking to make a mark in your field or in the field?
I would say you need to be passionate about food and very curious, because people who are going to read you are going to be very passionate and very curious about food. So you really need that. And you need to be stubborn, because as I was saying, it's very hard to get answers. And you need to ask why many times to many people before you get the answer. So it has the reputation to be very hard to cover as a journalist. And you need to think about the consumers too. You need to put yourself in their shoes and to write for real people who do their grocery and probably think that prices are too high. And you have to think about people who cook and understand what kind of stories they would like to read about. And you have to think about the industry too, because they have their point of view, they have their reality. So you need to think about the reality of suppliers. And most of all, you must always keep in mind that behind all those food you see in a grocery store, there are farmers this is a very difficult job. You can't control the weather. You have labor shortage. You have a lot of problem. Too much rain or not enough rain. So you, as a journalist, probably because of where I was raised, I always wanted to do a bridge between the rurality and the people who live in cities, so that they understand that their food come from the farmers, and they must respect them and understand the reality. When you live downtown, you don't always realize all the work there is behind a box of cereal.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. This is the Food Professor podcast, and if we were to ask you to be a professor for one day, and your course would be Food News 101, what would be your first lesson to your students? What would be the topic?
Well, I probably tell them that there is a food story behind every story or every event. I mean, when there is a storm somewhere, there probably, or big fires in California, there is probably a food story behind. If there's a war in Ukraine, there is a story behind. When you talk about whatever, when you talk about vacation or poverty or labor shortage or energy price, whatever you're talking about, you always can find a food story behind. What is the first thing you ask to people when they come from their vacation? You ask them if they ate well, right? So there is always a food story, and if you want to connect with people all around the world, there is one thing that connects people is to talk about food. And everybody eats and everybody likes food, so that's the best way to talk to people, create relationship, and get other stories afterwards. But my number one lesson would be try to find the food stories behind all the other stories you read in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Sylvain and I completely 100% agree, because that's one of the reasons we started. One of the reasons we started this podcast. And Anne-Marie, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. It was really fantastic to get to know you and your work. Congratulations, 20 years of reporting. You've got such a history of understanding and helping your readers understand a very complex industry. So once again, thanks for your time joining us on The Food Professor. Continued success, and I wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you today.
Merci, Marie-Ève.
All right, last couple of issues. Let's talk about India. So it came up in our last episode. You told us about the size of magnitude of goods from the agriculture sector bought by India. Now, we didn't think, or I didn't think there'd be such an immediate impact, but apparently they're already buying less.
I honestly, it's happening much more quickly than I expected. With Huawei back in 2018, 2019, it took really 3 months for China to rebut. And they use food safety as an excuse, which is often the case, by the way. But now India is just not buying. It's slowed down.
So I guess so. Where do they turn to their friends, the Russians, to replace that amount? What do you think happens there?
So my guess is that if I were India, and of course Canada is the largest supplier of lentils, their two choices are likely Turkey or Australia. That would be my guess.
Australia. I didn't know. Australia.
Yeah. So Turkey and Australia number 2 and 3 after Canada.
I had no idea.
So my guess is that they may actually, if they're actually not buying lentils, they're probably they already have a pact or deal with another country or a couple of countries, a couple of sellers, grain handlers, companies, because of course countries don't buy from countries. Companies buy from companies. So my guess is that India is trying to get grain handlers to focus more on India, coming from either Australia or Turkey. But that's just my guess. But what's unfortunate is that it is going to impact the value of Canadian commodities. That's exactly what happened with canola back in 2019 with China. And so, because if you turn around, you don't sell to China, you turn around, you sell to another country, that country knows that you're more desperate.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be able to charge as much. That's the problem with diplomatic tensions like this, when it's very public. When you're a Canadian company, they know that you have to dump your product somewhere.
Let's talk about, and this is fascinating, this is going to be a great discussion. California recently last week passed legislation that will take minimum wage for restaurant workers to $20 an hour. Now, let me set some context. And this happens, I think, in spring 2024, so it doesn't happen right away. It's 25% increase. Now, just for some facts for the listeners, the median fast food worker in the United States earned $13.43 an hour in 2022. In California, they made an average of 16, so that's why it's not. It's from 16 to 20. And this takes effect in April and equates to an average salary of $41,000. There are 550,000
That's a lot of people.
Fast food workers at 30,000 locations statewide. Sometimes we forget how big California is. Like, we're California, right? The entire country. So what do you think? I mean, listen, 80% of those workers are minorities, apparently. 2/3 are women. So this is, on the one hand, I'm thinking this through. I'm just starting to think through. I love to hear your thoughts. On the one hand, there's a population when they earn $20 an hour, that's going right back into the economy. On the other hand, there's a lot of operators who are going to struggle to afford a 23% increase. But maybe, and this gets to our theme about temporary foreign workers, they invest in technology instead. All right, what do you make of all this?
It's California. I think there's a couple of things happening there. For one, I think they're trying to deal with inequities and social inequities. Clearly, I mean, a lot of the workers at fast food, they consider these jobs as a career, and so they're really trying to make sure that they make a decent living. So that's ideologically, that's really the intent here. What is likely to happen is that the 550,000 people will go down to probably much less. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think there'll be a greater focus on automation. We're already seeing it, but it's just going to accelerate the pace even more with ATMs and robotics in the kitchen and all that stuff. But I actually think that embedded in that policy is a clear message against the fast food industry. I'm not sure that California is saying to the fast food industry, you know what, you're welcome in this state. I mean, we want consumers to start shifting towards other types of food, right? You've had your day to shine. Now it's time to move on. That's kind of how I'm interpreting what they're doing right now, and forcing the food service industry to focus on different types of products and not necessarily fast food. What are your thoughts on that? Well, what did you think when you saw that?
I had a lot of thoughts, actually. First of all, a quick check on Indeed tells me there are 57,000 openings in the state of California in the fast food business, according to a quick search on Indeed. So I'm not sure that number is going to go down the way you think it is, because like many instances, they can't find the people to fill the jobs that exist today. Now, why can't they find the people? At some price, eventually you find people. This is economics, right? So you start paying $20 an hour, you're just going to have more people move into that industry, and you're going to solve a labor issue. Can it make for affordable food at fast food? I think I agree. Should we just? It's funny because I'm not a fast food guy at all. I can't remember the last time, unless you cut. And I don't call Saint Hubert or Swiss Chalet fast food, but
it comes with service, yeah.
Well, even if I get it for takeout, I don't consider it fast food. But I'm not a fast food consumer, and I also think there's a restaurant in the United States. I visited it when I was in Orlando called Del Taco, and when you go through the drive-through, it is all AI, 100%. Machine vision, AI. You're talking to a machine. No, we talked to the guys because they were at a conference. They said nobody wanted a job, and it's not a job anybody wanted. So now we've got a machine that you train on a very limited set of information. It works really well, and by the way, it never gets tired of upselling. Never gets tired of upselling, and it adjusts what they're selling to what they have on stock and the temperatures. It's fantastic. And they said, listen, I'm not putting people out of work. I got 2,000 jobs open. I can't fill them.
Yeah.
So two things. One, the economics of the fast food industry. Super interesting, right? Does this increase in wage pull people from other industries? Or two, does it push them to invest? And we've been talking about this for 3-4 seasons. If you bring in cheap labor, people are going to use cheap labor. Price of labor goes up, you're going to invest in technology. So this is a lot. My overarching thought is, for the next 10, 15 years plus, a demographic shortfall in these jobs. The people aren't there to do them, and or they, immigration issues, they can't get a work permit to do it. I mean, there's thousands of people living on the streets in New York City right now.
But to maintain facilities, like that, you need different skill sets, right? You need people that are trained differently.
Sure.
I mean,
my own son actually, higher weight.
Yeah, my own son is a manager of a fast food chain outlet here in Halifax, and I mean he's seen it all now. Like he's hiring and firing people. And he's 20 years old. He's 20 years old. But
well, listen, fast food is a great place to learn.
But he already sees the limitations of the current model. I mean, at some point, like, do you actually want to deal with people smoking crack in a toilet? Like, seriously?
It's a great discussion because I think at one point you don't want to put all these family businesses out. Is there too much fast food? I love your point.
But I can tell you, when I wrote my op-ed about this policy this week, the biggest reaction was, we don't need this industry. This industry is killing people.
Interesting. Yeah. Super interesting.
Because when you drive through the States, when you drive, even in Canada, when you drive, what do you see on the road? Signs telling you where fast food outlets are. So they do influence a lot of behavior out there. And so people are questioning what is the role of fast food. So they do play a big role in our economy. And frankly, I don't mind. Some of these chains have actually innovated and provided us with new ways of thinking about food. Sure. And a lot of the innovation that we saw in the food industry came from fast food over the last, I'd say, 50, 60 years. But we do have to ask ourselves, what is the future of that industry now, given what's going on with social inequalities and challenges that we face with human capital in general? I am asking myself that question.
Last thing, are we hardwired to be vegetarians? New study on vegetarian genetics may say that the fact that we may like our plant-based is kind of in our genes. What do you make of that?
Yeah, actually, I was sent the manuscript. So, as you know, I'm an editor of an academic journal, and this manuscript was sent to me a few months ago. It's getting published now, so I can talk about it. But I thought it was an interesting. So this study comes from a med school in Edinburgh in Scotland. So they actually, in the study, they actually evaluate how we're genetically predisposed to become either a vegan or a vegetarian, and I thought it was quite interesting. Now, to me, I don't know what your thoughts are, but to me, food choices are much more complicated than that. It's about culture, traditions. It's very personal as well. If you want to eat meat, and one of the things that I challenged the authors on was, well, what about flexitarians? I mean, where do they fit in there? Is it like a binary issue here? It's yay or nay, or how does that work? So, I mean, I think it was an interesting paper, but I would actually take results with a grain of salt. You kind of have to be careful, especially when it comes to food choices in general.
Well, listen, I guess next time we're talking next week, we might get some insight into Thanksgiving in terms of Mr. Champagne, our minister, and what has come out of those discussions. But for now, let's leave it there. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, please subscribe or continue to follow and forward along to your friends in the food service, grocery, restaurant industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer growth consultant, keynote speaker, podcaster.
And I'm Michael's sidekick, the food professor, Sylvain Charlebois. Hey, have a good week.